May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our rock and redeemer. Amen. I was struck today by this service, but something of the serendipitous nature of it from the selection of your music. The opening hymn, Be Thou My Vision, was a favorite of my mother's, and I do understand what it means to be brought from a mighty long way. I would like to start by saying hello, Eden, just because I don't think I will ever get to say that again in life, and I never expected to hear myself say that. I must say that this occasion to find myself preaching in Eden has taken me quite by surprise for several reasons. My connection to Eden itself has taken a rather unusual journey. I had, of course, decades ago as a theological student, heard of this mythical place, Eden Seminary, due to reading the works of two of your more famous graduates, of whom you no doubt probably hear too often. That my personal connection to Eden, though, came at a particularly painful time for our community and church. In 2009, the war in Sri Lanka came to a devastating end, an end in which the violence inflicted on a section of the Tamil population trapped in the war zone is now drawing parallels to the war in Gaza. The primary difference, as scholars have pointed out, is that war in the northeast of Sri Lanka, in all of its brutality, was conducted in the dark, whereas what is happening in Gaza is happening in the full light of day. It was a war also where hospitals were bombed. The indiscriminate violence of the state was justified on the grounds that the brutality of the Tamil rebels, the LTT, ensured that it had to be defeated at all costs. The number of dead may be as high as 40,000 out of 400,000, or a percentage of 1/10 of the trapped civilian population. People were reduced to the most primitive of conditions, mothers draining water from a pool of rainwater that had a corpse in it to provide some liquid for their children. We still don't know how many died, and that's encapsulated in the title of a book of that end, which is called Still Counting the Dead. The decimation of this section of the population and the decades-long war left the Tamil community in the northeast devastated and subject to heavy military control. Our churches, its clergy, and its people never had the time to reflect on what happened to them, have time to heal and care for themselves, but had to pick themselves up and start the painful task of rebuilding our communities and congregations. After decades of ministering under conditions of war, our clergy also needed both respite and an opportunity to renew their theological education. On a visit to the United States, I was helped by friends in the Indiana-Kentucky Conference, an alumnus of Eden, Reverend Paul Chip John, and it was an opportunity to reconnect here with my friend and colleague, Damayanti Niles, who I'm happy is also still here today. But more importantly, the first steps were made for a relationship between Eden and our church and seminary in the north of Sri Lanka. Since then, several of our pastors have come to Eden to have an occasion of both personal respite, but also for personal renewal and a renewal of their theological learning and imagination. We hope, of course, that there will be more to come, though I'm told that a particular gentleman could have something to say about that. Another reason for being surprised at finding myself here is that in spite of my theological education, I have preached only sparingly, and to be invited to speak on this day of celebration, on this significant year in your history, and at an event so central to your community is a rare privilege. I would therefore like to thank President Deborah Krause and the faculty of Eden for their commitment to this partnership at a time of such distress to our community, and also for the welcome and support that they and students here have provided to our pastors. Lastly, of course, for the singular recognition and honor in inviting me to not only be a part of your celebration, dear graduates, but in asking me to speak to your graduates today. I must also note for the record, because I've been reminded of it several times, that my friend and colleague Damayanti Niles assures me that this is happening over her dead body. First of all, my congratulations to those of you who are graduating today. It is a day to celebrate your accomplishments and your completion of some years of hard work and dedication. For some of you, it will be a return to your vocation, and for others, it may be the start of exploration and discernment to sense where you're called to be. Therefore, I would like to use this occasion to share a reflection with you about the path that you and we may be called to tread, or rather that we might be called to rethink and reimagine what that path might be. Pilgrimages are often arduous journeys into places well off the beaten track, or to places central to our religious and spiritual communities. It is also a useful metaphor through which to understand the journey of our lives. They are journeys through which we both explore life and give shape to it. As a child growing up in northern Sri Lanka, in a peninsula and a town that is peripheral to the capital city in the south, I slowly started to become aware of a journey that many of our people would undertake. They would start life in a village, then they would move to the main town in our region, and then from there to the capital, and from there to any of the major developed countries in the West, and from there to end up in one of its metropolitan cities and centers. Obviously, for many, this was a migratory pilgrimage, a journey of economic advancement, and it had at its core an element of necessity to it, and of course it becomes quite conventional and routinized. Those of you familiar with living in the countryside or near the wilds will recognize this process by which a new path becomes routinized. At first, there are no markers of a path, but over time, a well-trodden path starts to emerge, and that it is no longer a new journey or trail, but one in which many of us have gone before. Another journey that I started to notice was one with apparently greater agency and less necessity, a journey of educational accomplishment. We start school in villages or small towns, then we study hard, and through our talent we get to a better school, and from there to university. And university would provide us another step on which to excel, so we could gain admission to a more prestigious university with higher studies. And of course, after that, through our talent, we would seek to get employed at prestigious universities or research institutions. And while this journey was made possible by our talent and ability, and was not driven primarily by economic need, it also tends to end up in the great metropolitan centers of the world. It bears many similarities to the economic pilgrimage, though it does seem to be more marked by our agency and our capacity to shape our lives. In observing the aspiration of these journeys, I found it was something deeply shared in our communities, regardless of religious or social background. Hindu parents at temples and Christian parents at churches would pray or make offerings to ask that their child would get admitted to good schools, then to universities, and to become successful professionals. Knowingly or unknowingly, we often share in some form of a prosperity gospel. We take for granted that there's a journey of improvement and advancement and progress that can and will occur in our life, and that it can be congruent with the exercise of our talent and with living out our faith fully as well as faithfully. We also expect that the Christian community or church can find a way to be part of a larger society without any serious incongruence or dissonance. However, I want to suggest to you today that in these conventionalized and routinized aspirations, there is a trap that we do not often discern. It hides within the routineness, sharedness, and repetitiveness of these journeys. This trap is perhaps most masked when we succeed, especially in education, and as a result of our success, we end up in the best places. The best places can be the most prosperous cities, the most diverse cities, the most progressive town, the prestigious church, and the it place to do alternative ministry. There we expect to grow and develop, to enhance our skills, our creativity, to become pioneers in fields of learning, or innovators in technology or professional practices, or have a distinctively impactful ministry. However, at the same time, there occurs a radical limitation of possibility and a thinning of our imagination. This was best illustrated for me by a speaker at a graduation ceremony at Harvard University in the 1990s. The speaker pointed out that at that time, 80% of Harvard's undergraduates, after graduating, would primarily end up living in 3 cities: Boston, New York, or San Francisco. It was a statistic that was startling, because we know that 80% of Harvard students did not come from those 3 cities. They came from not only all over the United States, but from all over the world. However, it would seem that excelling at Harvard meant that there were only 3 worthwhile places in which to live, work, and thrive. It would appear that as we excel and mark ourselves out from others by our skill and intellect, that the possible worlds we inhabit, rather than enlarging, start to radically shrink. Like thoroughbred racehorses, we may be magnificent, but we can only function in a very rarefied environment. This predicament reminds me of a quotation by the cultural anthropologist Clifford Geertz, who in turn took it from the sociologist Max Weber, when he wrote that we human beings are suspended in webs of significance that we ourselves have spun. It alludes to the fact that we build and create the social worlds in which we live, but the darker side of this is found in the Hindu myth that uses the same image of the spider's web to point to the illusionary nature of our knowledge, that the web we may have spun, nevertheless, it restricts and deceives us. The road that we follow becomes eventually, from repeated use, a rut from which we cannot get out to change direction, course, or destination. But we go on thinking that we are growing in knowledge and skill, and that we are participating in bold, innovative, and original action, work, and ways of living or doing ministry. Similarly, we allow Christian discipleship and vocation to settle into the rut that limits our imagination, and we assume that there's bound to be a progressive journey in our ministry that will inevitably lead to certain parishes or sites of ministry, that these will be the result of our skill and capability. In doing so, of course, we fall into this trap of what one of your distinguished predecessors summarized as the gospel of a Christ without a cross. The breaking of this illusion and the call to follow a very different path to that of progressive success and assured change and impact is the call of Christian discipleship that emerges from an encounter with the risen Christ. The Peter we read about when he is first called, if we remember how it starts, is all enthusiasm and damned if he's going to look before he leaps. He drops everything and takes off after Jesus. He may not have explicitly articulated it like the mother of James and John, but surely he was hoping to be near the throne when it all went as planned. But now when Jesus asks him, "Do you love me?" he knows what it is going to take and where it might lead. At this time, he is called to face the reality of the path of discipleship and to not deny Christ. I would like to reflect on this breaking of the traps in the webs we weave by hearing a word of wisdom from perhaps not the most obvious of sources. When one discusses musicians or music, there's always the fact that one's going to both disclose one's age as well as the parochialness of one's taste. In the mid-1980s, I was following my undergraduate degree in England when we had a somewhat unconventional speaker who came to talk to students. In the 1960s, just like the Beatles, another pop star had emerged from the city of Liverpool and had found great success just before them. His name was Cliff Richards. He remained, it seems, eternally popular in the UK, but he never really made it big in the US. He had also, during this time, in the 70s, become an evangelical Christian, and he would travel to universities, drawing on his popularity as a musician, to speak to students about his faith. Our university students, like other university students were quite typical and gave him a rather boisterous and rambunctious reception in the question and answer session. One of them memorably challenged him to say, "Are you trying to tell us that you, because now you're religious, that you were never into sex, drugs, and rock and roll?" And he just simply answered that he never did drugs. And then one of them then asked the typical question that often gets asked for all of us as people of faith, and particularly those of you who are entering into ministry. It is about how do you reconcile your faith in a God of love when there is so much suffering in the world? And of course, that is a question that is also close to our minds today. His answer continues to resonate with me over the years. He responded that he didn't have any easy or clear answer to this, but he wanted to share an experience. He had also, during his time as a committed Christian, volunteered his help to support a Christian evangelical relief organization called Tear Fund. And he said that he had been to some of the most painful places in the world where either natural disaster or war had devastated communities and countries. And he said that in every place that he went, that he would always encounter a small group of Christians who would be there working to support the communities, trying to just survive or rebuild their lives. That is all he said, but it was a profound answer and is something that I continue to think about. For him, the truth of the gospel, particularly in relation to the question of the pain of the world, lies in its ability to move people from the well-trodden path of personal development and advancement to the places where it hurts and where people are hurt. This understanding of the paths we are called to also challenges the profound inequality of our world. We are aware and recognize, I think quite easily, that inequality is driven by the unequal distribution of wealth. And those of us committed to a prophetic understanding of ministry or social justice join quite rightly in the demands for the redistribution of wealth. But what we often fail to recognize is that inequality is also built on and around the unequal distribution of human resources. That the problem of inequality is not only about the unfair distribution of finance capital, it is also about the unequal distribution of social and cultural capital. This social and cultural capital might be the result of privileged inheritance or of personal accomplishment. But if it is unequally distributed and concentrated, it also lays the foundation of economic inequality. If the best and the brightest, the most capable, including in theological education and ministry, join the rush to the same centers, how are we going to build a more equal world? I remember observing those who had finished their PhD in theology at Harvard Divinity School would often spend several years of the rest of their first years in education as teachers, spending all their energy and efforts to be able to come back as a teacher at Harvard Divinity School, imitating the 80% of undergrads who would flock to Boston, New York, or San Francisco. Our training restricts our imagination to think that even theological thinking can only be at its best in certain limited places, or that effective ministry can only happen in certain places. However, the call of Christian discipleship, the call to feed Christ's sheep, is a call to move ourselves and to build communities of faith that in turn move people to the painful peripheries of the world where God's people are in pain and distress. It is an invitation to move beyond the webs we have spun, or rather to spin new webs that connect people in relationships of new significance. It is also a reminder that if we want a more equal world, that the followers of Christ must be prepared to redistribute themselves. I would like to end by sharing a story of one such act of redistribution that connects a part of your country with the town where I now live and work, Batticaloa, on the southeast coast of Sri Lanka. It is increasingly customary to note in Sri Lanka when we travel that when you headed towards a town, that you will start to see statues erected by the roadside or at the center of junctions with figures of significance for the local community. and Batticaloa is no exception to this. Usually these statues follow quite conventionalized forms of presenting religious or culturally significant figures. But there is one in Batticaloa that breaks from known conventions. There is a metal statue of a Christian priest by the side of the lagoon. What is unique about him is that in one hand he is holding a cross, and in the other hand, a basketball. Every time I see it, it makes me smile at the incongruity of it. His name is Eugene Hebert, and in the late 1940s, he came to Batticaloa with a group of fellow Jesuits from Louisiana. Batticaloa, like Louisiana, has mangroves, but it is about as far away as you can get from Louisiana. They made Batticaloa their home, and they never left until their deaths. As can be guessed, Father Hebert was a very popular basketball coach, and the school he taught at St. Michael's is now nationally renowned to this day for their basketball teams, quite an achievement for a school from a small town on the periphery of the island. But the statue to honor Father Hebert, of course, is not put up for his basketball coaching. It has to do with his last act of ministry. In 1990, when the civil war in Sri Lanka resumed after a ceasefire, there were a series of bloody massacres that took place in the Batticaloa region. There were massacres by the Tamil rebels, the LTT, the Sri Lankan army, Muslim home guards, tit-for-tat killings that remind us of Gandhi saying, "An eye for an eye until the whole world is blind." These killings are still a painful memory in Batticaloa, and during these killings, Father Hebert set off on his motorbike to a nearby town to pick up a student of his, a young Catholic boy, Bertram Francis, and to bring him back to safety in Batticaloa. They headed back, but they never made it to Batticaloa. They joined the thousands of disappeared that makes Batticaloa in Sri Lanka the place with the highest rates of disappeared and war widows. It is widely understood that probably what happened is that they would have been stopped, and Father Hebert would have been asked to surrender the student so that he could be killed, but that Father Hebert refused, and that he was therefore killed as well. It is for this reason that a statue is there to remind us of someone who redistributed himself to this small town and then bravely lived in it at the most painful of times for the people of that region. Therefore, Eden graduates, confronting you is a call that probes you, that challenges conventionalized roots, ruts of prestige that present themselves as the path of your vocation. Wrestling with discerning your calling can, of course, be made more difficult by the response of your fellow graduates or colleagues in mystery. But there is a delightful remedy for our tendency and temptation to fall back on whataboutery to justify the decisions we make about ministry. In verse 21, Peter, as always, is looking for a way out. So he asks, "But Lord, what about him?" And many of us will think that, what about them? What about him? What about her who is doing this, doing that? And Jesus' answer cuts to the point by saying, "What's it to you?" What it is to you or me as to what our fellow graduates, colleagues in ministry, members of our parish, our family are called to do. What it is to us that they might be taking the conventional expected pilgrimage route. We are confronted with the call to reimagine the pilgrimage of our lives when Christ asks us thrice, "Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me?" If yes, then go to feed Christ's sheep in the places where they are in pain and distress. May God bless you and your work as you set off on this phase of the pilgrimage of your lives. Amen.